Hi. I wanted to read a short out of Mercedes Lackey. Hopefully that's okay. I don't know. I grew up reading her books as a kid. One of my favorites being the Oathbound series of Tethra and Kethri. I'm probably not pronouncing their names right. I don't know. Anyways, the very first short she has in here is called A Herald's Journey. And yeah, the map. I love this book. I got it for Christmas. Anyways. A journey begins. 12-year-old Taffrey Tallyman tightened his knitted muffler around his neck and carefully tucked his brown woolen breeches into his worn boot tops. Snow had been falling on the village of Declare since last night, and by now it was deep enough to be a considerable nuisance. Taffrey had already been out once this morning in a pair of old, threadbare, colorless breeches of his father's, discarded as too worn for patching. It had been his task to shovel the path that led from the door of his cottage to the village street, getting soaked to the skin in the process, for his father had to leave at dawn for his job. No fool, Taffrey, with only 2 pairs of winter breeches of his own, he didn't want to have to spend the rest of the morning shivering in wet clothing when there was a pair of discards in the rag bag that would do as work clothing. Nobody was going to be looking at his breeches while he shoveled, after all, and if they were far too big for him, well, that was all right. It meant that the worn places were not anywhere that it would count. Now, changed and dry again, with a bowl of hot bread and milk inside him, he was ready for his day to begin. Lessons at the village temple of Cairnos. He dressed for the weather. A heavy knitted sweater over his tunic, his muffler, a pair of mittens, and a knitted hat pulled down over his ears would get him from the cottage to the temple without freezing to death. These articles were so multicolored that he could have been a jester, although his mother had done her best to try and make some semblance of patterning in them. She knitted them out of the odds and ends she brought from other women who had already finished more uniform projects. He had no coat this year. The only coat the family could afford was reserved for his father, who worked out of doors as a carter all day. Taffrey had completely outgrown his coat last year, and there was no money to spare for the woolen fabric for a new one this year. Perhaps next year, or perhaps someone at the inn would spoil a blanket that his mother could bring home and piece into a new coat or cloak for him. His mother had a cloak, cleverly made of tiny pieces of whatever woolen fabric came into her hands, pieced together with embroidery stitches. She was so clever in her handiwork that it was, in Taffrey's opinion, and that of his father, a veritable work of art. She had just finished it, fortunately before this latest snowstorm. She had offered to make another for Taffrey, but he wasn't interested. That cloak was too feminine a garment for a boy. He would rather shiver than wear something that fussy and girlish. "Have you got your lunch in?" his mother called behind him as he reached for the wooden door latch. "Right here," he replied, turning to hold up the wrapped bundle of cheese and yesterday's bread for her to see. His mother smiled at him from where she was scouring the dishes with sand and hot water next to the fireplace that served them for heating and cooking together. Taffrey thought she was the most beautiful woman in the world, and not a lot of fine ladies that stayed at the inn where she worked as a maid could touch her. Her brown eyes were always merry, and she was never without a song on her lips from morning to night. Her employer, the local innkeeper, was a clever woman named Lily, a stranger to the village who had arrived several years ago looking for a suitable site to build a new inn. This worthy woman thought that Sandra Tallyman was as much a treasure as her own family believed. And although Chandra might be the inn's maid and occasional server, she got an extraordinary number of benefits besides her wages. She had been encouraged to bring her child along with her when Taffrey was too small to go to school, a concession that was completely amazing. In addition, she had the right to as much leftover food as she could carry home in a basket every night, the right to any ordinary clothing left behind if it had not been reclaimed in a year, and the right to torn or worn linen from the bed's ends. Lily was a generous employer, and the Tallyman family was well aware how lucky they were that she employed Chandra. "Mind the priest and do what he tells you to do," Chandra told her son, as she did every morning, raising her round chin a trifle and tucking a strand of golden brown hair back into the scarf tied about her head. "Oh, Mama," Teffrey replied. He was old enough now that the morning admonition was, well, unnecessary. He wasn't a little boy to be told to mind every morning. Ooh, give me a second. Anyways, hopefully they won't come back this way. "No sauce now," Chandra said, but with a smile, and a shooing motion for strong, square hands. Gratefully, Teffrey opened the door and escaped into the snow. Their cottage was at the heart of the village, although it was tiny. Just one room with the loft over the kitchen area where Teffrey slept. Larger and more expensive houses stood on either side. The slip of land the cottage stood on had once belonged to the farmhouse to the right, and had been parceled out for a hired man's cottage back in some long ago time when the village hadn't held more than a dozen homes altogether. To get to the street, a path had been made along the garden wall of this larger home, and that was the route Teffrey took now, with piled up snow on his left and the snow-topped brick wall on his right. This brought him to the single road that ran through the village of Declare. There was no village square in Delcare. All gatherings and celebrations were held on the village green, just on the other side of the road. The Helchers, prosperous merchants, lived in the big, half-timbered house on his right. They had a maid and a manservant to do their chores for them. This morning, their man-of-all-work was out shoveling their path, and he waved to Teffrey as the boy reached the road. Teffrey waved back. He didn't stop for a chat. Shoveling had taken time, and if he paused, he'd be late for school. All children went to school in the kingdom of Valdamar. The school term lasted from the end of harvest to spring planting. Some in the tiniest of the villages were taught by old folk, widows mostly, who would hold school session lessons and be paid a little for each child by the crown. But most lessons were taught in the temples of whatever religion one belonged to, it being considered that priests and priestesses in general were better educated than old women who might be a bit hazy in their arithmetic and numbers, higher than 20 and rather vague as to spelling. A child who didn't live on a farm or who didn't hire out for light chores during farming season could get additional lessons all during the spring, summer, and fall, if his family agreed and he was willing to add to the task. And, of course, any child whose parents could afford it could have tutors or share a highly educated teacher with others whose parents had the means. Very occasionally, where there was one of the houses of healing where several healers were stationed, a bardic retreat or herald's resupply station. Children might get their lessons from the healer, a bard, or even a herald. That was rare, though. Most relied on the homely resources of their own neighbors. Teffrey envied those children. He would have given a great deal for access to such tremendous sources of learning. Once a child could read, write, and figure to the teacher's satisfaction, his mandated education was over. Teffrey had passed that point last season. Now he kept up with his lessoning because he liked it, and his parents were willing to forego the added pennies he might have brought in doing odd jobs. Once the priest was done with him for the day, however, he would present himself at the inn and help his mother, and perhaps, if he was lucky, earn a copper bit or two as well, doing extra chores for guests, or for Lily. The Temple of Kurnos lay past the village green, in its own little grove of trees. It didn't look a great deal different from any of the larger houses in the village, in size or general shape. The room was made of native slate, the chimney and walls of stones, which came out of the fields every spring with exasperating regularity. There was a stone porch at the front of the building, and around at the side was a second cottage where the priest actually lived. Smoke arose from the chimney into the great sky, and Teffrey hurried up the path to that promise of warmth. Once he reached the porch, the first difference between this place and an ordinary house was evident. The door was big, taller, and much wider than normal. It was also carved with the head of a great stag. He pulled the door open and entered. Here is where the temple really differed from the other large buildings in the village. It was one huge room, stone-floored as well as having stone walls. Here inside the walls had been laid and plastered, then painted with scenes from the holy books. The roof above, wood planks supporting the heavy weight of the slate roof tiles, had great beams that had been carved with vines, flowers, and stags' heads. A wide hearth with a cheerful fire now burning on it had been set into the wall at the left. At the rear, decorated with evergreens, boughs, and expensive wax candles, was the altar. More candles, tallow this time, stood in wooden sconces mounted on the wall. But with all the light coming in, the real glass windows reflecting off the snow outside, they weren't needed this morning. They weren't needed this morning. This year, Taffrey was the oldest child being schooled here. Priest Offren looked up and smiled to see his favorite pupil enter. He and all the pupils were seated at a wooden table, and benches placed before the fire for warmth and light. But he didn't pause for a moment as he coaxed Sarah Hopewell through her stumbling recitation of the alphabet. He simply nodded at Taffrey's place at the end of the dark, well-worn table, and the open book waiting there for him. It was history today, Taffrey saw as he sat down in his place. The priest had marked where he was to begin and end with clean straws, and he read diligently while the younger children were drilled in reading, writing, and sums. There was a 2-year gap between him and the next oldest, a 10-year-old. Of the 11 other children his own age that had begun their lessons with the priest, all the rest were elsewhere this winter. Jem, Caleb, and Courtney were helping with farm work. Jillian, Joff, and Dougal learning their parents' crafts. Merrick, Tovey, Kyle, and Wyatt had all been apprenticed outside their parents' crafts because they were second and third children. And lucky Susanna had been sent away to a real board school where the girls lived while they studied and only came home on holidays. Some, so Susanna had told them, were even highborn. She said that this school was going to teach her fine and fancy needlework, the special manners that important people seem to require, and something called deportment. What anyone thought such things were necessary, Taffrey had no idea, unless it was to make her suited for a marriage with someone above her in rank, wealth, or state. But Susanna's parents were the richest in the village, and she was their only child. Nothing but the best was ever good enough for her. She wasn't exactly spoiled, but Taffrey didn't regret that she was gone. She'd always held herself apart from the rest of them, as if she was made of some delicate material, and was afraid to get smudged by their commonness. The book in front of him was not going to be one of his favorite texts. It was fairly dry and didn't give him much of the sense of what the time... Bleh. And it didn't give him much of the sense of what the times it described felt like. Still, Taffrey carefully committed the details of the chapter he was reading to memory. Books were precious things, and many of them were the rounds among the various temples in the region as various children were deemed ready for them. Once he had finished this one, he might not ever see it again. When he finished the end of the passage and had gone over it another 2 times to make certain he had it all firmly in his mind, he signified that he was ready by closing the book and sitting quietly with his hands folded on top of it. The priest looked up, saw that he was ready, and nodded within a few moments, while Taffrey watched the flames dancing on the hearth and became ever more aware of the fact that it could not be far to lunchtime. Priest Offren finished with the child he was working with, and came over to Taffrey. Taking the book from him, the priest opened it and marked the page and began asking questions about the chapter Taffrey had finished. Taffrey didn't get them all right by any means, but those he answered incorrectly, the priest corrected him on, and then went on. Priest Offren was very good at his sort of teaching. Taffrey had found that those things that he'd been corrected on tended to stay with him as well as the ones he got right. They were not quite finished when the noon bell rang at the baker's shop, signifying that those who had left their luncheons, there to be baked or heated along with the day's bread, pasties, and cakes, had better collect them. The priest put the book down on the table and smiled at the children, who now looked at him as attentively as any circle of puppies who had heard the word cookie. "Right, off with you," he said, and there was a flurry of arms and legs. Then the children were gone, out the door, heading to their homes, their lessons over for the day. None of them had any kind of hunger for knowledge that Taffrey had always shown. So, as Dauphin wisely said, it was no use in trying them past their patience. Their afternoon would be spent in chores and play, more of the former than the latter. In a village like this one, children did some work, at least, from the time they could be trusted with tasks. While Taffrey moved over the hearth to eat his bread and cheese, the priest dipped up a cupful of water from the pail for him, then went out to get his own luncheon, leaving him the only occupant of the temple, which echoed with every pop and crackle of the fire. Every time he shuffled his feet, Taffrey didn't mind eating alone. If he really wanted company, he could find one of his old schoolmates enjoying his or her own lunch where they now labored beside their parents or at their new apprenticeships. When he finished his meal, he got up and stretched, then decided to go outside for a little before settling on the afternoon lessons, which would probably be advanced ciphering. This would allow him to do a bit more than simple accounting. It wasn't a favorite lesson, but he was good at it. The day was still gray, the air a little damp, with a hint that there might be more snow to come. That was all right. More snow would mean that the people stopping at the inn might have to stay overnight or longer, and that meant possible tips and even a bit of work for him. He wandered down the path, across the green, and down to the road to see what there was to be seen. The snow creaked underfoot, another sign that there might be more of it forthcoming. At the luncheon hour, it was unusually quiet. No clanging and hammering from the blacksmith, the carpenter, or the cooper. No wood chopping. A few women were about, making purchases at the baker, the butcher, and the one shop at the village, but otherwise there wasn't anyone to be seen. No one on the road either, which was something of a disappointment. No, wait. Taffrey saw a distant movement, he thought, though it was hard to be certain against the white of the snow. Was there a rider coming? He peered down the road, noticing his intent gaze. The few villagers out on the street also peered in the same direction. And after a few moments, it dawned on all of them that they were indeed seeing something coming toward the village. But it wasn't a rider. Or rather, the steed coming toward them wasn't carrying a rider. And no wonder it had been hard to make out. White steed against white snow, saddled and bridled but not ridden. This was a herald's companion. And if it wasn't being ridden by a herald, then it was on search. Taffrey had only seen a herald, those dispensers and enforcers of the Queen's justice, a few times in his life. He had never seen a companion out on search before. He'd only known that companions choose their heralds, and that the people chosen went to the far-off capital city of Haven to learn the things they needed to know to be heralds. Heralds, so much in Valdamar, depended on the heralds. They could do all sorts of things, and virtually everything important in Valdamar involved them and depended on them. All heralds had magic of some sort or other, but they didn't all have the same sorts of magic their companions. Although they might look like beautiful white horses, were nothing of the sort. They had magic of their own, so it was said. But now the companion was close enough to see clearly, and he, for it was a stallion, claimed every bit of Taffrey's attention. He had never seen anything so gorgeous in his life. The companion stood a little taller than most of the village horses, but his head was bigger, his forehead broader, and his eyes were set a little further forward on his head than a horse's, giving him a very intelligent look. His coat was as white as the untouched snow, his mane and tail like twin waterfalls of ice spun into the finest possible thread. He wore a saddle of blue leather with silver ornaments, a biteless bridle to match, and a saddlecloth of deeper blue trimmed with silver embroidery. His hooves were silver too. He set them down as delicately and carefully as if he were dancing, and the nearer he came, the more Taffrey stared. He drank in the sight. He wanted to remember this for the rest of his life, for he might never see a companion on search again. Companions came looking for their heralds when the time was right. That was when being on search was all about. Usually the chosen was a child, but not always, and no one really knew what it was that the companions looked for, or waited for, or how it was that they chose one particular person above all others. Until that moment, they lived at Heralds Collegium in Haven. After that, they never left their heralds until they died. Oh, to be chosen as a herald. Only in a few wild dreams had Taffrey ever indulged in such a thought. He was perfectly ordinary in every way. The common son of a common carter and a non-village inn maid of all work. Children like that, they were never chosen. If anyone in this village would be chosen, it would be someone like Susanna. But he couldn't help it now. As the companion drew closer and closer, he was consumed with the longing that the stallion would stop in front of him. Looked deep into his eyes, aching with the wish that would be him this time. That for once in his life he would be touched himself by that special magic. The companion stopped in front of him. As the nearby villagers gasped, the stallion bowed his head down to Taffrey's level. Breath streaming from his nostrils, and Taffrey looked deep into eyes that were bottomless. Sapphire treasures holding warmth and wisdom, and he was falling into them. They filled his gaze, and he didn't want to ever stop falling into them. With a shock to heart and soul, he felt an empty place he hadn't known was inside him suddenly fill with warmth and joy. And he felt something inside himself rushing to fill a similar place inside. Adeleon, for that, he knew without knowing how he knew, was his companion's name. His companion. Your companion, Taffrey. I choose you. You will be my herald.